Well, some of you know that I've done a few introductions already today, but this one is particularly an honor for me. I want to begin by signaling the end of this lecture series that has been organized by Donald Mackay and a very enthusiastic group, a somewhat changing group of students, undergraduate and graduate students. The idea that this school will increasingly be a place where we look at the activity as collaborative, and the proof of that, of course, is in the many, many initiatives, including the event that occurred today. I take great heart in that, and I give a lot of the credit for it to my colleague Donald Mackay, who has championed this view of the culture of the school, especially since the moment we conceived of the idea of relocating to the site that we're on now. So I'm hugely grateful to him. I'm hugely grateful to Andrea Hunniford and all the other students who have been engaged in planning and executing this series. I'm very grateful to George Baird, our guest speaker tonight, for his participation in the conception, planning, and the ongoing delivery of the series. His involvement in each one of the lectures as a kind of interlocutor, a responder to the talk. I'm sure it hasn't always been easy for him, and it's particularly difficult at the end of somebody's address to ask difficult questions, and he has mostly been extremely respectful and understanding of the people who've made the effort to come down here and speak. But tonight is his talk, and there's no one going to respond to it except to say thank you. I am honored to introduce George, and as you well know, have you just witnessed, I like speaking extemporaneously, but because of the particular importance of this event, I have actually written a text to introduce George, and I am going to read it. George Baird is one of the most distinguished figures in the history of Canadian architecture. True. A writer, a researcher, a designer, a teacher, he has had an unprecedented influence on the profession and the shape of Canadian cities. George Baird was educated at the University of Toronto and immediately proceeded to London, England to carry out research at University College. During this period, he collaborated with Charles Jenks in editing and writing an article for the book Meaning in Architecture, 1968. One of the seminal documents in contemporary architectural thought, it argues against the reductive and deterministic systems of thinking applied to architecture by the so-called modern movement, and inserts a symbolic reading of the built environment connected to language, the past, and contemporary philosophical discourse. It was a key document in the genesis of postmodern art and architecture. 10 years later, George Baird, back in Canada and teaching at the University of Toronto, co-edited and partially authored yet another absolutely crucial document in the development of architectural theory and practice in the late 20th century. Vacant Lottery was co-edited with Toronto architect Barton Myers and published by Design Quarterly in 1978. In this book, Baird took on the failure of urban renewal and the destruction of the traditional fabric and community in North American cities. Here the argument was for a new approach to urban design. Rather than raising whole urban quarters, Baird and Myers argue for an approach that takes cues from existing patterns of built form and public space. The influence of this text is impossible to overestimate. Meaning in Architecture and Vacant Lottery are landmarks in modern architecture at an international level. George Baird is also co-author of a crucial study in the development of Toronto. On Building Downtown was commissioned by the Crombie administration in Toronto to lead the way forward after the city slapped on the famous 45-foot height restriction in order to put a stop to rampant high-rise development and the destruction of downtown neighborhoods. On Building Downtown changed Toronto forever. It argued for the primacy of public space and the need for all buildings to defer to the city as a community rather than stand as isolated forms. Since these extraordinary documents were published, George Baird has continued to produce texts of international significance. Most significant, perhaps, 1995 MIT Press publication, The Space of Appearance, Baird's reflection on the implications of the philosophy of Hannah Arendt in the conception and design of the North American city. George Baird has been practicing architecture for more than 40 years. He founded George Baird Architects in 1972. He took Barry Sampson as a partner and practiced as Baird Sampson Architects from 82 to 98, and then as Baird Sampson Neuert Architects. This firm produces the most consistently thoughtful and innovative work in Ontario. The projects range from master plans for cities such as Kingston and Regina, institutions such as the Cranbrook Academy in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, through public spaces such as the Bay Adelaide Park and Cloud Gardens Park in Toronto, to individual buildings of the highest quality, the Butterfly Conservatory for Niagara Parks Commission, student residence for U of T Mississauga, and recently the most environmentally responsible and urbane public school in Toronto in decades, the Thomas Wells School in Scarborough. The firm has won multiple national and provincial awards. George Baird became an associate professor of architecture at the University of Toronto in 1968, was promoted to full professor in 1976. This is a dream for some of us. In 1993, he was appointed professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, and between 1996 and 2003, he was director of professional graduate programs at the GSD. From 1994 to 2003, he held the G. Ware Travelstead Professorship in Architecture at Harvard. In 2003, he returned to Toronto to be the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto until his retirement in 2009. In 1986, George Baird was elected Fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. He's lectured at universities around the world, including holding the Preston Thomas Memorial Lectureship at Cornell and the Davenport Visiting Professorship at Yale. In 2000, George Baird was awarded the Order of Da Vinci, the highest honor given by the architectural profession in Ontario. In 2010, he was awarded the RAIC Gold Medal, the highest honor for a Canadian architect. And in 2012, the American Institute of Architects and the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, which represents all 138 schools of architecture in North America, named George the winner of the highest honor available to a North American architectural educator, the Topaz Medallion. Let us also celebrate the fact that George Baird is one of us. I first met George in 1970 when, as a second-year Waterloo student, I was asked by a distinguished architect from Toronto if I thought George should be the new director of our then very young school. I went to watch him in action in reviews at the U of T and was completely enthralled by his energy, intelligence, and eloquence. He did not become our leader, but he has influenced several generations of young architects, none more so than the current faculty members at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. Several among us consider him the most important of our mentors. Professor Baird has taught as an adjunct faculty member at Waterloo. He has served on countless occasions as guest lecturer, critic, external examiner on graduate theses. His contribution has been remarkable. Tonight, I will remind you with the greatest honor and pleasure that he is a graduate of the University of Waterloo School of Architecture by virtue of his having been awarded an honorary degree by this university in 2011. Tonight we celebrate this, his greatest honor, and all the others. Please join me in welcoming George Baird.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, I have to say, even if it was about me. It reminds me of the first time I ever met Kenneth Frampton in North America. I had met him in London briefly, but then he moved to Princeton. And the first time I went to lecture at Princeton, I had a huge suitcase, which I was looking, this is long enough ago that it was before luggage had wheels. Some of you are old enough to remember that era. So I was lugging this impossible suitcase across the campus, and Kenneth was coming in the other direction to meet me on the campus, and his opening remark was, "I'm glad to see that you're human," he said. I might have a similar response tonight. I want to thank Don Mackay for asking me to participate in this series, which has been enjoyable for me on an ongoing basis. And up until tonight, even the weather cooperated in our getting back and forth from Toronto. So I've enjoyed myself, and thank you to him for the invitation to participate in this unusual way. I also want to thank Rick Haldenby not only for that extraordinary introduction, but for having performed as a sort of, it's not exactly an alter ego, but a kind of a parallel presence in architectural, the closest by kind of director of a school through much of the time of my teaching, certainly at the University of Toronto, and someone with whom I have, as he's pointed out, been in rapport since 1970. So I really, well, maybe I can quote the Aga Khan here. I happened to be present when Prime Minister Harper presented the Aga Khan with a honorary Canadian citizenship. And he said, "Your Highness, I want you to know how welcome you are here in Canada." And the Aga Khan, whom it turned out is a far smoother speaker than Stephen Harper, an observation which will probably not surprise you, responded, "Mr. Prime Minister, I have always felt very welcome in Canada, but never more so than now." So I could make a similar remark about always feeling welcome in Waterloo, never more so than now. So thank you all for that. Now to turn to this talk. The reason I'm giving this talk is that it's the thing I'm working on at the moment. And as you're about to discover, it's a somewhat unwieldy beast, and it's clearly a work in process. But I think it's interesting, and so bear with me. It's a bit of a roller coaster, but I hope you find it interesting to some degree. When one considers that his own academic field is comparative literature, it has to be said that Frederick Jameson has had a surprisingly large impact on architectural history and theory over the past few decades. Beginning with his now famous 1982 lecture at New York's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, Architecture and the Critique of Ideology, and continuing to the present day with commentaries on such figures as Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas, Jameson's writings have significantly influenced many historians and theorists in our field, not least such figures as Michael Hayes of Harvard or Reinhold Martin of Columbia University. I myself have not been part of the Jameson following. Indeed, when I was asked by Nadir Lahiji several years ago to contribute to an anthology of essays conceived as a tribute to Jameson, I came to realize that I had insufficient familiarity with his work to be able to do so in a timely fashion, and as a result did not participate in that project of publication. Indeed, up to that time, based on my limited reading of texts of Jameson, most of them ones explicitly referencing architecture in one fashion or another, I found myself first puzzled and subsequently irritated by his recurrent invocation of the concept of utopia, typically relatively late on in the development of his arguments in the respective texts in question, subsequent to his various iterations and explanations of the implacable grip of late capitalism on the world. Utopia tended to appear as a qualifying indication of the continuing presence, if not a readily accessible one, of a more hopeful alternative political possibility. But in connection with his invitation to contribute to the anthology he was assembling, Lahiji encouraged me to read a text of Jameson's that was earlier than any I had looked at up to that point, and that preceded the author's writings on architecture and urbanism. The text in question was was The Political Unconscious from 1981. Reading it was something of a revelation for me. I found it a magisterial and, to my mind, a very ecumenical survey of literary theory, from Joseph Conrad through Claude Lévi-Strauss and Northrop Frye to Paul Ricoeur. All this through the lens of Jameson's own neo-Marxist frame of reference. Interestingly enough, in reading the book, I even learned something of the intellectual background of my Harvard colleague of long standing, Michael Hayes. I knew that Hayes was an admirer of Jameson, but reading The Political Unconscious made clear to me the origin of Hayes' distinctive reading of the concept of ideology as framed by the French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser. For there, in a lengthy excursus by Jameson, was precisely the articulation of the concept of ideology that I had first learned at Harvard from Hayes. In the conclusion to the same text, Jameson took it upon himself to spell out in much greater detail than I had seen elsewhere in his writings the role of the concept of utopia in his thinking. As he put it, now I'm quoting from him, "Any Marxist analysis of culture can no longer be content with its demystifying vocation to unmask and to demonstrate the ways in which a cultural artifact fulfills a specific ideological mission, in legitimating a given power structure, in perpetuating and in reproducing the latter, and in generating specific forms of false consciousness or ideology in the narrow sense," that's in brackets. It must not cease to practice this essentially negative hermeneutic function, bracket, which Marxism is virtually the only current critical method to assume today, that's Jameson talking, but must also seek through and beyond this demonstration of the instrumental function of a given critical object to project its simultaneously utopian power as the symbolic affirmation of a specific historical and class form of collective unity, end of quote. For Jameson, quoting again, a Marxist negative hermeneutic, a Marxist practice of reading analysis proper, must in the practical work of reading and interpretation be exercised simultaneously with a Marxist positive hermeneutic or a decipherment of the utopian impulses of these same still ideological texts, end of quote. In short, Jameson's complex construct of ideological critique is itself quite Althusserian. One of the other implications of that for his thinking is that active, quote, active lucidity about ourselves, to use his terminology, is not possible for the individual human subject. Accordingly, earlier in the same text, he took pains to dismiss the possibility of a, quote again, vision of a moment in which the individual subject would be somehow fully conscious of his or her determination by class and would be able to square the circle of ideological conditioning by sheer lucidity and the taking of thought. In the Marxian system, only a collective unity, whether that of a particular class, the proletariat, or of its organ of consciousness, the political party, can achieve this transparency. The individual subject is always positioned within the social totality. More recently, I came also to understand the scale of the influence of Jameson on Reinhold Martin, whom I think has been here relatively recently, if I remember correctly, historian and theorist at Columbia University and academic director of one of the most influential doctoral programs in our field. Martin recently published a collection of essays entitled, significantly enough, Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism Again. The collection includes a range of topical texts, some of which have been previously published. Among the best, in my view, are those devoted to an account of two head office projects for the American multinational corporation Union Carbide, the first one on Park Avenue in downtown Manhattan from 1960 and designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and the second in the forested hills of suburban Connecticut from 1982 and designed by Roach Dinkeloo. These two are then compared and contrasted with the Union Carbide industrial facility in Bhopal, India, that exploded with such catastrophic consequences for its workers and surrounding residents in 1984. Less compelling for me, and here I have to confess to an intellectual conflict of interest, was an essay on the effort of architectural theorists in the late 60s and 70s to employ a linguistic analogy to expand and reinvigorate techniques of analysis of architectural form in the social world, an effort in which I was myself an active participant. But most interesting for me was my gradual realization as I worked my way through the book of the extent to which Martin's critical method followed that of Frederick Jameson. It was not the form of ideology critique which was disconcerting. After all, Jameson, Martin, and I, all to a greater or a lesser degree, belonged in the intellectual tradition of the critical theory that had been formulated in the 1920s by the revisionist Marxist Frankfurt School, of which I'm sure many of you have heard, including such figures as Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Indeed, reading Martin's text, I realized how useful a Jamesonian model of critique had been for him in previous books, as well as in the impressive account of the Union Carbide projects in this one. It is necessary to point out that Martin's use of the term utopia is not exactly parallel to any of Jameson's. Indeed, in Utopia's Ghost, it reads as a nostalgic reference to the ambitious social project Martin implicitly ascribes to heroic period modernism in architecture. Still, I did not expect an author of such independent intellect as he had seemed to me to be to rely on yet another theoretical armature appropriated from Jameson. And this in turn gave me further pause, for it suggested, given Martin's growing influence in our field, that these particular usages of the concept of utopia might well gain even greater sway than they have had to date. It is now time for me in this presentation to articulate this concern of mine explicitly. Throughout much political theory, from the 19th century all the way to the present, one finds frequent reference to a greater or lesser degree to a political conception that lies midway between the grip of capital on consciousness on the one hand and the version of utopia as a posited alternative on the other. The political concept in question is human agency. And as my citations from Jameson above make clear, his model of ideology and his dismissal of the possibility of lucidity on the part of the individual human subject do not leave much room for agency. For my own part, I derive my conception of agency from the political thought of Hannah Arendt, in whose writings it is given expression as action. But this is not its sole source. In a recent issue of the London Review of Books, the Cambridge political scientist David Runciman referred to, now I'm quoting from Runciman, the German social democrat Edward Bernstein, who said at the end of the 19th century, this is a quote inside a quote now, this is Runciman quoting Bernstein, the movement is everything, the ends are nothing, end of Bernstein quote. Bernstein's remarks, said Runciman, were directed at his Marxist colleagues who liked to explain how wonderful things would be after the revolution and made no attempt to organize for justice in the meantime. Bernstein thought that they were frightened of democracy because it was too messy, and as a result were squandering the chance to improve people's lives, preferring to wait for a future that would never arrive. End of quote. Now, it is well beyond the scope of this text of mine, or for that matter, beyond my own intellectual capacities, to fully articulate the varied nuances of emphasis between different strands of revisionist Marxist theory in respect to agency from the late 19th century to the present, most especially in the wake of the deliberations of the various protagonists of the Frankfurt School. Still, it does seem to me that any intellectually adequate political/theoretical stance for our times must necessarily take greater and more considered account of the phenomenon of agency than Jameson's ideology critique is able to do. Indeed, it is possible even to note detect some notes of equivocation in Jameson's own writings in this regard. Notwithstanding the obduracy of the passages from the political unconscious that I have cited above, in his subsequent text, Architecture and the Critique of Ideology, he can be seen to ruminate in regard to the relative degrees of local political success attained by so-called red communes in Italy, such as Bologna, and he entertains the possibility that some promising manifestations of a new order might even be possible in such enclaves within the overall hegemonic capitalist system. He even concludes that essay with a conciliatory nod to political speculations of Henri Lefebvre and Antonio Gramsci that are considerably more open to consideration of agency than his own are. But even here, he dismisses in a footnote the, quote, the idea that people will rebuild their own dwellings as they go along, end of quote. A dismissal that is very consequential given the direction of the argument that this presentation of mine is about to take. For my own part, I would say that it is not difficult to draw an alternative line of intellectual lineage from Bernstein to Rosa Luxemburg to Hannah Arendt. It is interesting to note that Arendt herself had a mid-career change of heart in respect to the possibilities of agency in human affairs. In her magisterial survey of the late 1940s, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she deduced that political action had been precluded in Nazi Germany and in the Stalinist Soviet Union, not, she thought, by economic hegemony, as with Jameson, but rather by the sheer depth and comprehensiveness of the political control of a subject population. As a result of this conviction of hers, she was caught off guard by the 1953 rebellion of workers against the Ulbricht regime in East Germany, and by the 1956 revolt against the Soviet occupation in Hungary. In recognition of these unexpected developments, she shifted her intellectual position and propounded a view of the potential of action in her next book, The Human Condition of 1958, that is significantly more optimistic than that expressed in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Accordingly, I would be ready to concede that my reservation about some of Jameson's and Martin's uses of the concept of utopia can, in political theoretical terms, be called Bernsteinian. Nonetheless, it is my view that it is not even necessary to undertake such a comprehensive historical explanation in order to be able to outline some of the problematic implications of such a relative indifference to the phenomenon of agency in the fields of architecture and urban theory. To begin to do so, let me refer you to a recent publication by a newly returned Torontonian, the former European bureau chief of the Toronto newspaper, The Globe and Mail. This is Doug Saunders. 2 years ago, actually it might be 3 years ago by now, Saunders published a book It was the winner of the 2010-11 Donner Prize for the Best Canadian Book on Public Affairs and was cited in a New York Times review as arguably the most important book on urban affairs since Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of the Great American City. It is entitled Arrival City. It is an account of the ongoing current migration of some 5 million persons per month from around the world, from their rural villages and agricultural settlements to one of some 20 urban settlements that Saunders names arrival cities, major metropolises in a number of cities around the world. And upon their arrival there, of course, one of the first actions of these people is to construct dwellings for themselves, as likely as not even on land over which they have no control. As Saunders points out, these settlements have had many names: slums, favelas, basties, bidonvilles, ashwayat, shanty towns, kampongs, urban villages, geckocondylar, and barrios. Notwithstanding the fact that many of these terms are pejorative ones, Saunders argues that the new neighborhoods to which they refer are instead a triumph of contemporary social and political energy and optimism. They provide their inhabitants with new economic and potentially educational opportunities, and they expand the economies of the larger urban conurbations of which they form a part. Through remittances back home, they constitute a major source of financial support for members of their families still there. For example, Saunders indicates in his book that rural Bangladesh receives almost $11 billion every year from overseas migrants and their descendants, this being a sum equivalent to all of Bangladesh's annual export earnings. It is difficult to remember how recently it is that such informal settlements attained any kind of normative status in the world. Right up until the 1960s, it was common for governments in countries in which they were being created simply to raise them before their political status could be consolidated. Indeed, as often as not, the rhetoric of heroic period modern architecture was often invoked to legitimize such governmental destruction. 3 important books were published in the 1970s to challenge such high-handed governmental activities, as well as the modernist rhetoric that was legitimating them, but they all seem to have been forgotten. Just to remind you, this is Architecture versus Housing of Martin Pauly from 1971. This is John Turner and Robert Fichter's Freedom to Build, also from 1971, and Turner's own Housing by People from 1976. Saunders acknowledges the fact that upon their arrival in the new city, the migrants are in need of assistance. Some of this comes from family members and friends who are already there, but governmental support is also important. Saunders goes to considerable length to evaluate the various governmental responses to the arrival of such migrants in their cities and notes the wide range of successful and failed strategies in this regard. The successes are apparent in such arrival cities as Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, and Toronto, and in unsuccessful ones in those such as Berlin and Paris. Not only are social support systems important, municipal infrastructures, water supply, sewers, electricity, movement systems need to be incorporated into such settlements after the fact. One of the most important factors in the successful maturation of such settlements is security of tenure for their occupants. After all, most of the buildings have been constructed with considerable effort by their occupants, yet they do not usually hold title in any form to the land on which they have constructed them, at least not in the first instance. In many of the settlements whose recent improvements have been deemed to produce social and political success, a key factor has been the establishment of a form of security of tenure, sometimes outright property ownership, and sometimes a lesser form of long-term security. It is, of course, precisely this security that encourages the residents of such districts to continue to make improvements to their homes. In the striking case of Istanbul, this has even led over time to a form of gentrification of some such areas on the part of second and third generation inhabitants. So we actually start getting, medium density, multiple residential buildings being constructed. Now, I would argue that one essential way to describe this phenomenon of migration and or urban resettlement would be to call it as dramatic a manifestation of human agency that it is possible to imagine. These persons may not have succeeded in achieving a perfectly active lucidity, to use Jameson's term, in respect to the overall conditions of their existence, but they have surely succeeded in transforming their lives, as well as the lives of the members of their families, both those who have come with them to the arrival city, as well as in the original settlement back home. But this is not the only aspect of this phenomenon that puts me in mind of historic tenets of political theory. After all, the fact that security of tenure for these persons is so important for their future puts me inevitably in mind again of Hannah Arendt and of her lesson from the 17th century British philosopher John Locke in regard to the key relation of property ownership to citizenship. For Locke, property ownership was an essential premise of citizenship. For Arendt, not quite so, but she was all too aware of the profound Lockean implications of this relationship for citizenship, and therefore for agency as well. Linking Saunders' arguments to those of Arendt, we may point to the work of the South American economist Hernando de Soto, who has argued that a key tool needed by the rural to urban migrants of that continent to prosper in their new urban settings is access to a secure form of title to their assets, primarily land, that would provide such long-term security of tenure for them. Now here I need to say that this question of ownership and security of tenure is, needless to say, a complex one, and I do not claim at this point in the development of this thing to have definitively addressed it. And this is a slide I've borrowed from a colleague at the University of Toronto, Patricia McCarney, with whom I teach a course on cities. And I thought this is an interesting chart because it actually depicts this is a gradually diminishing modalities of tenure, if you like, from freehold, fully legal at the top, down to nothing at the bottom. And it's not a clear-cut black and white distinction there. It's a kind of much graduated kind of hierarchy, and needless to say, the graduation has kind of implications for my argument that I have not as yet, fully attended to. Let me now turn to another strand in the overall argument I am attempting to construct. In the history of modern architecture, in the first half of the 20th century, we all know well enough the implicitly socialist orientation of the architectural projects and urban proposals of the heroic period of modern architecture, at least in its dominant Northern European modality. And one of the most important, although rarely discussed aspects of that socialist orientation, was the expectation of the radical reduction of the extent of private property in cities and the control of most urban land, if not by the municipality, then at least by collective entities of various kinds, cooperatives, nonprofit organizations, etc. It is only the most blatant example of this expectation that is evident in Le Corbusier's famous proposals for the rebuilding of Paris. On the one hand, the plan voisin, as we see here, or the city for 3 million, as we see here. A more subtle case, to my mind, is the view of Candelas, Josick, and Woods as late as 1964 that their competition entry for the rebuilding of war-damaged downtown Frankfurt, this is a view of the site after the end of the war, and this is the famous competition entry, unbuilt, for downtown Frankfurt, that the rebuilding would be proved to be implementable on account of their hope that the entire parcel of land on which the project was proposed to be located would be owned by the city. As Shadrach Woods put it, and I'm quoting now from Woods, such a development, of course, would require some revision of existing laws governing public and private property, but the law is essentially reactive, and enough precedents exist to cover most of the cases involved here. Obviously, the scheme would work best if it were all in public ownership, end of quote. Now, despite the fact that such expectations on the part of contemporary architects in most of the world are now quite obsolete, one sees little acknowledgement of this reality in present-day architectural and urban theory. Nor is there any of the separate, but perhaps even more important question of the still relatively highly differentiated pattern of the ownership of urban land in our world. A recent visit to Japan prompted me to develop a growing interest in this matter of differentiated patterns of ownership of urban land. A Japanese colleague, Yoshiharu Tsukamoto, whom you see here with his wife and partner, Momoyo Kijima, Tsukamoto has reported to me that he has discovered, as part of his own urban research, that in the city of Tokyo, there are some 1.8 million individual parcels of urban land, and that these parcels are owned by no fewer than 1.7 million different private individuals or groups. It is clear to me that this significant statistic explains a good deal about the urban form of that city. In the book that made them famous, Made in Tokyo, cover of which you see here, for example, Tsukamoto and Kajima, together with a colleague, Junzo Kuroda, carefully documented the Tokyo tradition of devising very complex mixed-use buildings or mixed-use hybrids of buildings and infrastructure combined. I'm sure you're familiar with this. The tennis courts on top of the parking garage, when this kind of unpacks it diagrammatically. Sorry, on top of a warehouse. This is shops underneath the railway overpass. Also documented here. But in their more recent publication, Pet Architecture, which you see here, Tsukamoto and Kajima have hiked the political and economic stakes of the debate further still and documented an extensive series of very small buildings erected on very small parcels of land throughout Tokyo. So if those of you that have looked at Pet Architecture will know this sequence as well. In each case, we get a photograph of the building in question, followed by, an analytical site plan and axonometric. Here's another one. We're looking at this one end on. Looks like that in the explanatory diagram. This is a seriously small site. Well, here's another seriously small site. And here's another one. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that both these extraordinary and unique phenomena, the multi-use building complexes and the very small buildings on very small parcels, contribute substantially to the particular urban character of Tokyo. Indeed, arguments have been made that they even define the form of urban redevelopment over time in that city. For example, in his recent book, Emerging Architectural Territories in East Asian Cities, Peter Rowe has argued that during his term of office, Prime Minister Koizumi saw this pattern of land ownership as an impediment to the, in his view, necessary modernization of Tokyo's business districts. As a consequence, according to Rowe, Koizumi introduced policies at the political level of the national government, level, to counter local municipal opposition and to encourage such massively large-scale redevelopments in Tokyo as Shiodome, which you see here, or Roppongi Hills, which actually you're seeing two of them here, Roppongi Hills and Tokyo Midtown, which are not too far apart from one another. As it happened, Shiodome and Tokyo Midtown were built on exceptionally large parcels that were already in unified ownership, some of them even public ownership. Accordingly, it was not difficult for the national government to facilitate their redevelopment. On the other hand, Rowe reports that the Mori Building Corporation had to deal with 600 different owners in order to assemble the land for its Roppongi Hills project, and even then had to agree to make some 400 out of the total 600 financial partners in the development in order to secure their cooperation in making their land available for it. It is my sense that Tsukamoto and Kajima would see Roppongi Hills as problematically atypical for Tokyo, and that they continue to be more interested in the ongoing contemporary evolution of the fine grain of micro-development that more commonly typifies that city. I mean, you're probably all aware of the occasional and quite startling outbursts of intense indignation which from time to time overtake Rem Koolhaas's public performances. In this regard, I point you to the kind of vitriolic contempt for the Roppongi Hills project, which is expressed in one of his publications' content. Yes, oh yes, so I'm referring now to this more typical characteristic of this fine grain of micro-development that more commonly typifies Tokyo. I show here two astonishing examples of this grain that I came upon myself in Tokyo. And by the way, I apologize for the next few images which were taken before I realized their profound academic importance for my purposes. They were just tourist photos. This is a so-called pencil building erected on a small parcel opposite the apartment that my wife and I were staying in Kagurazaka. Second is an even more remarkable one I discovered walking around Ginza. I'm going to show it to you first here. This doesn't have a laser, or does it? No. It doesn't. Well, here, let me go over. This is a model that was in an exhibition at the Japan Foundation in Toronto of a chunk of Ginza. That's the building I'm talking about there. I think, if I remember correctly, the parcel it sits on is about 12 meters by 10 meters, something like that. And that's a view up its facade. Astonishing. Now, I would speculate that the fine-grained pattern of land ownership that still, notwithstanding Koizumi's interventions, largely typifies Tokyo is one that bears relation to the same political economic circumstances that typify the successfully matured favela as we have seen it evolve in other parts of the world. We have, for example, seen that this Gecekondu, you've seen this slide already, in Istanbul has now reached a sufficient plateau of economic maturity that multi-story apartments are beginning to be erected in it. In short, I would argue that political agency can, among other things, be seen as a product of the forms of urban development that are typical of cities with a highly differentiated pattern of the ownership of land. Indeed, a Toronto land economist known for his strongly conservative political views once observed to me in conversation that emergent urban centers in the periphery of Toronto, whose land holdings were broadly controlled by large development corporations, tended to grow more slowly and in much less urbane fashion than those with more differentiated patterns of ownership of developable land. The example I would point to here is compare North York City Center with Mississauga City Center, and you can get an indication of the kind of sort of, greater and lesser degrees of urbanity and of sort of, concentrated development intensity in those two comparative examples. Indeed, it is possible to see the comprehensive public ownership of public land foreseen by the architecture and urban ideas of the heroic period and the large-scale corporate control of large areas of urban land in the world today, such as is increasingly typical in advanced contemporary cities, as two sides of the same problematic coin. In neither case does a real property market exist. Only a relatively highly differentiated pattern of land ownership, such as in Tokyo, or at least long-term land tenure, can create such a market. And let me say, if you can stand a little more political theory, let me say that in the middle of rehearsing all this, I actually read an astonishing book by an economist, long dead, and not particularly popular at the present time. Certainly, this is a book that had been on my bookshelf for decades, and that it was actually reading the David Runciman article in the London Review of Books, which inclined me finally to get this book down off my shelf and read it. It's a book called The Great Transformation by the economist that basically his career was roughly between 1900 and 1960, called Karl Polanyi. He's actually the uncle of John Polanyi, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist from the University of Toronto. And Polanyi in that book makes an astonishing, it's basically a critique of liberalism, and it's basically the formulation of the critique of the emergence of liberalism as a body of social and economic ideas in Great Britain in the first quarter of the 19th century. And by the way, a surprising amount of it, to my architect's eye, at the hands of the notorious Jeremy Bentham, whom I knew Bentham was a consequential historical figure. There was no doubt about that. And he's actually attacked in Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. But I hadn't appreciated the extent of his influence on the evolution of British politics in the early years of the 19th century, the destruction of the guilds, the overtaking of common lands. It's a bit like Chicago-style economics. In fact, it's very, very funny. Polanyi, in his book, reconstructs the collapse of the world economy from 1929 through to the 1930s as a result of the Great Depression and the concomitant collapse of democracy in various countries in Europe, and the ways countries abandoning the gold standard and so forth. And it's uncanny reading this book, which is written in 1944, to see the echoes with the kind of ricochet effects of the 2008 fiscal crisis in the world banking system. The second crisis of liberalism, you might call it. In any event, I can't rehearse Polanyi's whole argument here in an excursus out of my own main text, but Polanyi actually argues, and in ways which are intriguingly similar to Arendt. I mean, it's not, Arendt doesn't say this, but there's an amazing kind of reciprocity between their thinking. He's in favor of a market economy. He wants a market economy. Polanyi is not a Marxist. In fact, Polanyi criticizes, in The Great Transformation, Polanyi criticizes Marx for accepting too much of the economic theory developed by the preceding British thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So he thinks the problem with Marx is that he's too much of a capitalist. He hasn't gone far enough. All right? But Polanyi himself wants a market economy. He just does not want the market economy to encompass all factors of human existence. And the three specific categories of social phenomena that he wants to exclude from the market are land, labor, and money. You remember Muslims have a problem with usury, all right? And it's kind of difficult to imagine capitalism without usury, all right? So there are fascinating kind of reverberations there. I mean, our friends the bankers would be incredulous at propositions such as Polanyi's being seriously tabled. On the other hand, this is not a wild-eyed crazy person talking. This is a deeply thought-out proposition. So and he argues basically that before liberalism, there wasn't a land market. And that is, of course, one of the reasons why, if you go back and think about the holdings of the church, the common lands, there were lots of cooperatives, the guilds, there was, in pre-industrial Britain, there were all kinds of systems of administration of property which did not entail a land market. So it's fascinating, fascinating. So whether, since as I've said, large-scale corporate control and large-scale public ownership of land look to me like two sides of the same coin, it could be that the highly differentiated property market that I'm arguing for here and a no property market at all might have interestingly similar socio-political implications. So, but there again, another part of the argument that remains to be figured out. So I would argue then that from the favelas of the contemporary world to the center of Tokyo, agency and the evolving forms of urban development that can be seen in both are closely interrelated phenomena. What is more, they are phenomena that cannot, in my view, readily be captured by a Jamesonian schema that manifests so little interest in them. And not only that, the neo-avant-garde that arose from the ashes of the postmodernism that so troubles Reinhold Martin strongly identifies, as he also does, with the utopian aspirations of heroic period modernism. As I have already pointed out, one of the key features of that modernism was an assumption of the comprehensive, the comprehensive availability of urban land for modernist urban projects and an indifference to the characteristic extant urban phenomenon of differentiated land ownership. The fact that this is such a basic premise of the period the avant-garde is so nostalgic about has had a very curious and troubling consequence. Indeed, even though that neo-avant-garde has most typically behaved very apolitically, it has always been ready to make sweeping urban design gestures that ignore, or failing that, pretend to ignore, the contemporary realities of differentiated ownership of urban land. Here are a few examples. This is Tom Main's Spreebogen competition project for Berlin. Just the building goes where it goes. Look out if you happen to be in the way. Here it is again. That, by the way, you can see the Reichstag sort of lurking in there somewhere, but somewhat upstaged. And this, of course, is a master plan by Zaha Hadid. Accordingly, then, this neo-avant-garde's most successfully implemented projects have tended to depend on clients that are such large corporations as Reinhold Martin typically deplores,
or hegemonic states, be they petrostates or authoritarian ones. Here we are in Beijing with Rem Koolhaas, or Alexandria with Snøhetta. So it strikes me as more than a passing political irony that the absence of agency from Jameson's own thinking has contributed in a trickle-down fashion to the apolitical readiness of the neo-avant-garde to work to realize their projects. In this regard, it has taken an iconoclastic renegade, sometime avant-gardist, like Rem Koolhaas himself, to observe, as he did in his 2011 Chronochaos exhibition at the New Museum in New York City, that as compared with their heroic period predecessors, the participants in present-day architecture's star system, quote, have traded power for celebrity. In conclusion, I would like to refer back to the reference made by the New York Times reviewer to the Saunders book that compared it to Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. For of course, a few years after she published Death and Life, Jacobs and her family moved to Toronto, where she spent the rest of her career. This makes her a fellow Torontonian with Saunders himself. The first book Jacobs published after Death and Life, The Economy of Cities, was still written in New York, but all the publications that followed, ones that were increasingly devoted to considerations of economics, often urban economics, reflected her experience of Toronto. The interest in import replacement, the idea that the formation of cities historically precedes that of agricultural hinterlands, the interest in the loosening of municipal regulatory frameworks so as to facilitate local enterprise, all these were developed by her in her second career in Toronto. It is interesting to note that it is not difficult to track analogies between a number of her arguments about urban form and Saunders' ones about arrival cities. They share a conviction that cities are problems in organized complexity, as well as an interest in incremental as opposed to wholesale forms of redevelopment. Remember Jacobs' fateful comparison in Death and Life between gradual money and cataclysmic money, the first capable of generating much urban benefit, and the latter a great danger. This speculative comparison of mine has caused me to wonder whether I might be seeing a Toronto school of urban and economic thought coming into being. For it has also occurred to me in preparing this presentation that one might add one more name to the list of Torontonians with consequential things to say in these matters. Naomi Klein has no particular interest in urban issues per se, let alone architectural ones. But her most recent publication, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, spans much of the same historical period that Jameson's recent publications focusing on culture and politics have done. The shock doctrine cannot be described methodologically as cultural critique. It reads more like a political detective story in which we see unfold the development of international economic policy over the past half century, who did what, where, when, and how. In fact, I doubt that Klein can even be called a Marxist, even though she is clearly a formidable critic of late capitalism. But her methodological preference in the framing of historical description is to identify individuals with power and to track their fateful decision-making over the period of her investigation. So she names the Chicago school economists led by Milton Friedman, who in her view have been responsible for so much of the gravely damaging neoconservative economic policy of the past 35 years, not to mention of the series of dictatorships with whom they forged alliances to implement those policies, whether the citizens of the countries in question were in favor of them or not. She also salutes the courage of the small number of individuals who resisted it, sometimes with unexpected success, such as the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, in 1997, and the President of Argentina, Nestor Kirchner, in 2007, both of whom adamantly refused to obey dictates of the International Monetary Fund when presented with them. Such is the power of agency in the hands of individuals, even in the darkest episodes of contemporary history. In my opinion, it behooves we architects and urbanists to take much more active account of the profound political implications of its actuality in our ongoing architectural and urban work. Thank you.